My name is Walter Grimes. I'm 63 years old, a retired electrician from Knoxville, Tennessee. And I never in my 63 years on this earth thought I would be the kind of man who installs a hidden camera in a child's bedroom. I raised my son to be decent. I buried my wife of 31 years. I paid my taxes and kept my yard trimmed and minded my own business the way people in our neighborhood do. But there are moments in a man's life when minding your own business becomes a kind of cowardice. And when it involves your 8-year-old grandson, there is no such thing as someone else's business anymore. Let me start at the beginning, because this story doesn't make sense unless you understand who Noah was before everything changed. My grandson was the kind of child who made every room louder and warmer just by walking into it. From the time he could talk, he had opinions about everything. Which flavor of ice cream was scientifically superior? Why dinosaurs were objectively more interesting than any living animal? Why his grandfather absolutely needed to watch this one specific episode of this one cartoon right now. "Grandpa, right now. It'll only take 20 minutes. He had my late wife Eleanor's eyes, this bright, restless shade of hazel that never seemed to hold still. He laughed with his whole body. When something surprised him, his mouth would drop open in this completely unguarded way, and you couldn't help but smile, just watching him exist. My son Derek has worked for a pipeline inspection company for about 12 years now. The work takes him away from home for stretches at a time, sometimes 2 weeks out, 1 week back, sometimes longer, depending on the contract. It's demanding. It's physical. And Derek has always been the kind of man who carries the weight of providing for his family on his shoulders, like it's the only thing that matters. He married Sandra about 10 years ago. She was quiet, pretty, came from a church-going family over in Mville. They had Noah 2 years into the marriage. For a long time, from where I was standing, everything looked fine. I live about 20 minutes from their house. Since Eleanor passed 4 years ago, I've made it a habit to stop by on Sundays for dinner and to spend time with Noah. That was our arrangement Sundays at Derek and Sandra's table. Sometimes a Saturday trip to the park or the hardware store if Noah wanted to tag along, which he usually did. He called me Pop, which Eleanor had gotten him started on when he was just learning to talk, and it stuck. I loved that name more than I can explain. The first time I noticed something was off, it was a Sunday in late September. Derek was on a 3-week rotation out near Midland, Texas. I came by around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the way I always did. Sandra let me in at the door, told me Noah was upstairs in his room, said dinner would be ready in an hour. Normal enough. But when I went upstairs and knocked on Noah's door and pushed it open, he was sitting on the floor with his back against the bed, not playing, not reading, just sitting there in the half-dark, with his knees pulled to his chest. When he saw me, he smiled. But it was the kind of smile that arrives a second too late, like he had to remind himself to do it. "Hey, buddy," I said, crouching down to his level. "Everything okay up here?" "Yes, sir," he said, quietly. He got up and hugged me, and that was normal. Noah had always been a hugger, but I noticed he felt tense in a way I hadn't felt before. I noticed the shadows under his eyes. I noticed that at dinner he sat very still and watched Sandra more than he watched me, and not the way a child watches someone they love. It was the watchfulness of a small animal that has learned to read the weather. I told myself it was probably a phase. He was missing his dad. Derek had been gone almost 2 weeks. 8-year-old boys get moody. I told myself that, and I drove home, and I let myself believe it. But it kept nagging at me, the way a loose wire will nag at you. You can ignore it for a while. It doesn't spark every time. And then, one day, It does. The second Sunday, Noah was quieter still. He barely touched his dinner. At one point, Sandra asked him why he wasn't eating, and he immediately said sorry and picked up his fork. And the way he said it, not defensive, the way kids usually are, not dramatic, just immediately, reflexively. Sorry, like he'd already calculated the cost of giving the wrong answer. That word, that one little sorry, sat in my chest wrong for the rest of the evening. After dinner, I helped Sandra with the dishes and asked her how Noah had been. She dried a plate and said he'd been tired lately, probably a growth thing. Kids go through phases. She said it easily, pleasantly, the way you'd discuss the weather. I watched her face, and there was nothing there I could point to, nothing obviously wrong. But I drove home that night with both hands tight on the wheel and Eleanor's voice in my head, the way it sometimes comes to me when something matters. Eleanor had a way of knowing things before there was any evidence to know them. She used to say, "The body keeps score before the mind catches up." I think that's what was happening to me. I called Derek that night. It was late after 10 o'clock, and he was tired from the shift, but he picked up. I told him I thought Noah seemed different lately, quieter. I told him about the shadows under his eyes, the way he ate, the way he watched Sandra. Derek was quiet for a long moment on his end of the line, and then he said, "Yeah, I've noticed it too, Pop, on our video calls. He seems, I don't know, far away. I asked Sandra, and she says he's fine, just missing me." I told him that might be all it was, and I tried to believe that. I said it. A week later, I came by on a Wednesday afternoon unannounced. I'd told Sandra I'd left my reading glasses there Sunday and needed to pick them up. The truth is, I just wanted to see Noah outside of the Sunday routine, outside of the expected hour in the set table, and the performance of everything being fine. Sandra opened the door and seemed mildly surprised, but not unwelcoming. She told me Noah was in the backyard. I went through the kitchen and out the back door and found him sitting on the bottom step of the deck, drawing in a notebook. When he heard the door, he turned, and for just a fraction of a second before he recognized me, his face showed pure, unfiltered fear. It vanished the instant he saw it was me, replaced by genuine relief, and he came to me quickly and took my hand, which he hadn't done in a while. He was getting to the age where hand-holding wasn't cool anymore, but he held my hand that afternoon like he didn't want to let go. I sat down on the step beside him and asked to see what he was drawing. He showed me a picture of a house with a big tree in the yard and a stick-figure dog. "Nice dog," I said. "What's his name?" He told me the dog's name was Rocket. I asked him if he wanted a dog, and he shrugged, then said, "I think we could get one when Dad gets home." There was something in the way he said "when Dad gets home" that I felt all the way down. I said, "Hey, buddy, you know you can talk to Pop about anything, right? About anything at all." He nodded but didn't look up from the notebook. I said, "Is there anything going on that you want to tell me? Anything that's making you feel sad or worried?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at the door to the kitchen. Just checked it quick and careful, the way you check for something you've learned to be afraid of. He looked back at his drawing. "I'm okay, Pop," he said, but he held my hand tighter. I drove to a Best Buy in the west side of town the next morning. I'm not a technology man. I still have a flip phone that Derek has been trying to talk me out of for 3 years, but I know enough. And the young man in the electronics section was patient and walked me through it slowly. I bought a small camera about the size of a thumb, the kind that looks like a USB charger or a little white cube. He showed me how to connect it to my phone, how to view the feed, how it recorded motion automatically and stored the footage in a cloud account. I paid with my debit card and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, holding the box and thinking about what I was doing. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about the way Noah's face had looked before he recognized me in that backyard. I thought about that reflexive sorry over a plate of untouched food. I drove to Derek's house. Sandra wasn't home. She had mentioned she had a dentist appointment Wednesday mornings. Noah was at school until 3 o'clock. I had a key. Derek had given it to me 2 years ago for emergencies, and this felt in a way I couldn't entirely articulate yet, like an emergency. I let myself in, went upstairs to Noah's room, and spent about 10 minutes following the instructions on my phone. I placed the camera on the second shelf of his bookcase between a model airplane kit and a stack of chapter books. From that angle, it covered most of the room. It looked like nothing, like a small white cube between two ordinary things. I called Derek from the car before I pulled out of the driveway. I told him what I'd done. There was a long silence. Then he said, "Pop, I've been thinking about calling you for 3 days." There was something in his voice, a tightness I recognized as a man trying very hard not to unravel. He said Noah had cried on their video call 2 nights before, and when Derek asked what was wrong, Noah had started to say something, and then gone completely silent, like something had startled him off the ledge of telling the truth. Derek had asked Sandra about it afterward, and she said Noah had been having bad dreams, that she was handling it, that Derek didn't need to worry. I told him I'd let him know what I found. "I need you to tell me the truth," he said. "Whatever it is, I will, son." I told him, "I will." That night, I didn't sleep much. I checked the app at 11 o'clock, and the room was dark and still. I checked it again just after midnight, and that's when I saw the door open. Sandra came into Noah's room quietly, the way you move when you're practiced at not being heard. She closed the door behind her. The room was dark, but the camera had night vision, so I could see everything in that gray-green light. Every detail sharp and terrible. Noah was awake. He was lying completely still under his blanket with his eyes open, and when the door opened, he pulled the blanket up to his chin in a single motion, the automatic motion of a child who has rehearsed this moment many times. I sat up in my bed in my empty house in Knoxville, with my phone in both hands, and my heart going somewhere between too fast and stopped entirely. I heard Sandra's voice very low and very calm. The calmest voice I'd ever heard her use, calmer than I'd ever heard her in an ordinary conversation. And that calm was the worst thing about it. She told Noah that she'd been watching him at dinner. She told him that he'd been distracted and slow, and that she had told him before what that meant. Noah said, "Please, Mama," in a voice barely above a breath, a sound so small and so careful that I can still hear it now if I let myself. She told him to be quiet. She reached into the pocket of her robe and took out what I could see was a wooden spoon. Noah's whole body contracted under that blanket. His knees came up, his shoulders curved in, and he became as small as he could possibly make himself. I was already out of bed. I was already looking for my car keys. I called Derek while I was pulling my shoes on. Didn't wait for him to say hello. I said, "Derek, I'm at the camera. I'm watching it right now. She's in his room with a wooden spoon. I'm getting in my car." He made a sound I had never heard my son make. He said, "Pop, go. Go right now." I said, "I'm going. I'm calling 911 on the other line." I drove to that house in 17 minutes. I know because I watched the clock the whole way. It was 12:24 when I'd called Derek, and it was 12:41 when I pulled up to the curb. I had already spoken to a 911 dispatcher who had taken the address and said a unit was en route. I didn't wait in the car. I used my key. I went straight upstairs. The door to Noah's room was closed. I opened it without knocking. Sandra spun around. Noah was sitting up in the bed with his knees to his chest, and even in the dim light from the hallway, I could see his face was wet. Sandra looked at me with an expression that went through three things very quickly. Surprise, then a kind of recalculating, then something that tried to settle into calm and didn't quite make it. "What are you doing here, Walter?" she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement trying to become one. I didn't answer her. I went to Noah. I put myself between him and his mother, and I crouched down, and I took his face in my hands, and I said, "Pop's here, buddy. You're safe. I've got you." He looked at me for a moment, like he was trying to confirm I was real, and then he grabbed me with both arms and held on so tightly that I had to put my hand on the back of his head to steady myself. He was shaking. He wasn't making a sound. That silence from a child who had once filled every room with noise was the most heartbreaking thing I have ever witnessed. Sandra said, "This is completely out of line, Walter. You had no right to come into this house." I said, "I had every right. I have a key and a very good reason." She said, "Nothing is happening here. He just had a nightmare and you're overreacting." I said, "I have it on camera, Sandra. All of it. I watched it live from my house 20 minutes ago." The change in her expression when I said that was the only honest thing I saw from her that night. The police arrived 8 minutes after I did. 2 officers, a young woman, and a man about my age. I met them at the door. I showed them the footage on my phone right there in the hallway, both of them leaning in to see the small screen. And I watched the man's jaw tighten. He handed the phone to his partner and went upstairs. I stood at the bottom of the stairs with Noah, who had come down with me, and was now sitting on the bottom step with his head against my arm. I kept one hand on his shoulder. I didn't let go of him for a long time. Sandra was brought downstairs. She was talking, explaining, using words like discipline and guidance, and I was doing what's best for him. The young officer was writing things down with a very even expression that I respected. Sandra asked where Noah was and was told to focus on answering questions. At some point, Sandra said she wanted to call her mother. The officer said that was fine. I thought about that for a moment, the mother she wanted to call, and I filed it away. Noah was examined by a paramedic who arrived with the 2nd unit. He was checked over in the living room with a female officer present, and me sitting nearby where he could see me. The paramedic found bruising on his lower back and the back of his upper arms. Old bruising, not from tonight. The officer who was documenting everything looked at me when the paramedic said, "Old bruising," and I nodded once because I understood what that meant, and I wanted her to understand that I understood. While all of this was happening, I called Derek. He had been calling me every few minutes, and I hadn't been able to pick up, and when I finally got him on the line, he was barely holding together. I told him Noah was safe, that the police were here, that I had the footage, and so did they. I told him to get home as fast as he could. He said he was already in the car on the way to the airport. He had already booked a flight. He had not waited to hear how it turned out. That was my son. That was the man he is. I stayed at that house until the children's services worker arrived, a woman named Miss Braddock, who was calm and thorough, and spoke to Noah in a quiet, even voice that he responded to. Noah held my hand the entire time she talked to him. She asked me at one point if there was a family member he could stay with safely that night, and I said, "Yes, with me." And she made some notes, and after a while longer, she told me I could take him. I put Noah in the back seat of my car, with a blanket Sandra had not touched, and I drove him to my house in Knoxville. He fell asleep before we got to the highway. He slept slumped against the window with one hand still curled around the sleeve of my jacket, and I drove very carefully, the way you drive when something precious and fragile is in the car. The next morning, Derek arrived. I was in the kitchen making eggs when I heard the front door, and then I heard Noah, who had been sitting at the kitchen table, poking at his orange juice, suddenly push back his chair and run. I heard the sound of my son saying his own son's name, and I stood at the stove with a spatula in my hand and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard and the gray Tennessee morning sky, and I let them have that moment without me in it. After a while, Derek came into the kitchen with Noah attached to his side, and my son looked at me across the kitchen, and there were no words that would have done anything useful, so we didn't try to use any. He just put one hand on my shoulder and gripped it once. The way men in our family say things, we don't know how to say out loud. Later, after Noah had eaten and was watching television in the living room, Derek and I sat at the kitchen table, and I showed him all of the footage. Not just the night I'd called, the camera had also captured 3 nights before that. Shorter episodes, same pattern. Derek watched with his elbows on the table and his face in his hands, and he didn't say anything for a long time after. Then he looked up and said, "How long has this been going on?" I told him I didn't know for certain. The camera had only been there a week. Based on the bruising, the paramedics' assessment, and the fact that Noah had the practiced stillness of someone who had learned a routine, it had been going on for a while, maybe months. Derek asked me why Noah hadn't told him. I said the same thing that had been weighing on me since the night before. Because he was told not to. Because he was small, and she was the adult in that house every single day when Derek was gone. And she had all the power. And Noah had understood that telling was the most dangerous thing he could do. Derek called his attorney that afternoon, a woman named Garrett, who handled family law and had dealt with custody matters, and had a voice on the phone that made me feel for the first time in 2 days like someone was steering the situation rather than just reacting to it. She told Derek to secure all the footage in multiple places, which I had already done. She told him to get Noah evaluated by a pediatric doctor and then a therapist as soon as possible. She told him that the police report and the children's services involvement already gave him strong grounds for emergency sole custody, and that she was going to file that morning. Meanwhile, I was thinking about Sandra's mother. Her name is Joyce Halford. I had met her at the wedding 10 years ago at Noah's birthday parties over the years, at a handful of holidays. She was a pleasant, church-organized woman who always brought a dish to pass and had opinions about other people's parenting that she offered freely. I had never particularly liked her, but had never had a reason not to tolerate her. That morning, I had remembered something from the camera footage, not from the night I'd called, but from 2 nights prior. Sandra had been on the phone in Noah's room after one of those episodes, and the camera had picked up her voice. She was talking to someone. She was saying he cried again tonight, but I handled it. A pause then. "Mama, I know. I know you think I should be firmer. I'm doing what you told me. I told Derek. I told his attorney." His attorney told the detective assigned to the case who had been scheduled to interview Sandra that morning. What Joyce had said on that phone call and what Sandra had quoted back to her mattered. Whether Joyce would be charged as an accessory or as someone who had knowingly encouraged the abuse would depend on what the investigation found. But she would not be stepping back from this quietly. The detective had already requested Sandra's phone records. 2 days later, Derek took Noah to see Dr. Pard, a pediatrician who specialized in working with children who'd experienced trauma. Noah was examined carefully. The bruising was documented. Photographs were taken. Dr. Pard was a gentleman with gray at his temples, who crouched to Noah's level and talked to him about superheroes for 5 minutes before asking him a single medical question. He told Derek afterward that the physical evidence was consistent with repeated blunt force trauma over a period of months, not weeks. He said Noah would need to see a therapist, and he referred us to a woman named Dr. Vance, whose office was over on Cherokee Boulevard. Dr. Vance had a waiting room with low bookshelves and a fish tank, and Noah spent the first visit almost entirely reading the spines of books and watching the fish and answering questions in words of one syllable. But the second time he talked a little more, and by the third time he told me on the drive home that he liked it there, that Dr. Vance didn't make him feel like he was in trouble. That was the first time since any of this had started that I'd heard anything like relief in his voice without fear right behind it. The custody hearing moved quickly, given the evidence. Derek was granted emergency sole custody within the week. Sandra, who had been released pending charges, was served with a restraining order that prohibited any contact with Noah. Her attorney filed a counter-motion claiming Derek's extended absences for work made him an unsuitable primary custodian. Derek's attorney presented the footage, the medical documentation, and Dr. Vance's preliminary assessment. The judge reviewed all of it and denied the counter-motion. She did not mince words in her ruling. She said that a parent who inflicts deliberate physical harm on a child under cover of the other parent's absence does not get to use that other parent's work schedule as a shield. I was in the courtroom that day, sitting 2 rows behind Derek. When the judge read that, I looked at my hands in my lap and breathed slowly and did not let myself cry until I was in the parking lot. Sandra was subsequently charged with child abuse and cruelty to a minor. The charges were serious, and the evidence was substantial. Joyce, her mother, was not charged as an accomplice. The phone records and the footage were not quite enough to establish legal liability on her end, which was a frustration. But the detective who handled the case told Derek privately that the investigation into her role was ongoing and that she had been interviewed at length. Derek's attorney filed a motion requesting that Joyce be added to the no-contact order covering Noah. The judge granted it. Whatever Joyce had told her daughter to do, she would not be anywhere near my grandson while this hunt worked itself through the courts. I want to be honest about something, because this story would be incomplete without it. There were days in those first weeks when I did not handle everything well. There was a night about 2 weeks after the court hearing when Derek had taken Noah for a walk, and I was alone in my house, and I sat at my kitchen table, and I thought about every Sunday dinner I had attended, and smiled, and passed the green beans, and driven home, telling myself it was probably just a phase. I thought about Eleanor, who would have seen it sooner, who had the kind of animal instinct about children that I had always counted on her to have, and no longer could. I thought about the old bruising the paramedic had documented. Months, she had said. Months. And every Sunday I had sat at that table. That's a weight a man carries. I don't believe it will ever be entirely gone. But Derek sat across from me one night after Noah was asleep and told me something I've turned over in my mind many times since. He said, "Pop, she was careful. She was very careful. There was a reason she waited until Noah was alone. There was a reason she did it in the dark. People who do this kind of thing are not careless. They are strategic." He said, "The question isn't why didn't you see it sooner? The question is what you did the minute you had reason to suspect. And I did something. That's what I hold on to." Noah started 2nd grade at a new school that fall, a small school in the neighborhood near Derek's new apartment, which he had rented 2 miles from my house. Derek negotiated a shift in his work contract. Regional projects only. Home every night. A pay cut he accepted without complaint. He told his company he had a family situation, and his family came first. and if that changed the terms of his employment, he understood. His company, to their credit, worked with him. The new school suited Noah. His teacher was a soft-spoken woman who sent Dererick a note at the end of the first month saying that Noah was a bright, engaged student who asked more thoughtful questions than any child she'd taught in 10 years. She said he had a particular gift for making other kids feel included. Dererick showed me the note on his phone, and we sat with it for a moment in a way that didn't require any words. Noah started talking more again slowly at first, cautiously, but the volume and the energy were there underneath, waiting. One evening in December, I came over for dinner, and he met me at the door and told me at considerable length and with a great deal of technical detail about a documentary he had watched about the deep ocean. He talked through dinner about bioluminescence and pressure and the creatures that live in the dark parts of the sea where there is no light at all. Dererick caught my eye over Noah's head and smiled in a way that held about 10 different things at once. After dinner, while Derek was doing the dishes, Noah and I sat on the couch, and he showed me drawings he'd made of the deep sea creatures. The anglerfish, the vampire squid. He told me the anglerfish was his favorite because it makes its own light. He said, "Kind of like you, Pop." I said, "Is that right?" He said, "Yeah, because you came when it was really dark, and you found me." I looked at that child for a moment, and I thought about Eleanor, and the hazel eyes, and the way he laughed with his whole body, and I said, "I'm always going to find you, buddy." And I meant it, the way you mean something that is no longer a promise, but has simply become a fact. Dr. Vance told Dererick in November that Noah's progress was meaningful, but that some things would take time, which was honest, and which I appreciated more than easy reassurance. She said, "Children who experience sustained trauma in a caregiving relationship sometimes carry a low-level watchfulness for years, not debilitating, not defining, but present." She said the most important thing was what surrounded Noah now, the consistency of Derek's presence, the predictability of safety, the freedom to be loud and curious, and completely himself, without consequence. She said he was one of the lucky ones, and she said it in a way that made clear she had seen many who were not. Sandra's case moved forward through the courts. Over the following months, she entered a plea. She was sentenced to 18 months in a supervised rehabilitation program with mandatory psychological treatment, 5 years of probation, and permanent loss of parental rights to Noah. Her attorney had argued for leniency on the grounds of a difficult childhood and mental health struggles that had gone untreated. The judge acknowledged those factors and incorporated treatment into the sentence. He also said clearly that acknowledgement of the roots of a behavior is not the same as excuse for the behavior, and that Noah's well-being would be the fixed point around which all other considerations organized themselves. Joyce Halford sent a card to Dererick's apartment in the spring. It said she was praying for the family and hoped there could be reconciliation in time. Derek held it for a moment and then put it in the recycling and did not mention it again. Some doors once understood clearly are better left closed. I want to say something to the parents and grandparents watching this, because I think it matters. I almost talked myself out of it. That's the truth. I almost told myself I was an old man imagining things, projecting my grief for Eleanor onto a little boy who was probably just going through a phase, overstepping into my son's marriage, making a problem where there wasn't one. The voice that tells you not to act, that voice sounds very reasonable. It uses words like privacy and trust and wait and see. It is fluent in the language of minding your own business, and sometimes minding your own business is the right thing. But when a child pulls a door shut with their eyes before they even speak a word, when a child who has never stopped moving goes very still. When a child says sorry before they've even been asked what they've done, your gut is telling you something that reasonable words cannot override. Trust the gut. That is the thing I would say if I could say only one thing. Trust the gut and then move. Don't wait for perfect certainty. Don't wait for someone to hand you a signed confession. Move towards the child. Put yourself between the child and whatever is frightening them, and figure out the details from that position. I think about the camera on that shelf between the model airplane and the chapter books. This small white cube that looked like nothing, and how it changed everything. I had thought sitting in that parking lot at Best Buy that installing it was an extreme measure, that I was perhaps crossing a line. Now I understand that the line I would have crossed by not installing it, the line between doing something and doing nothing while my grandson went through another night of that. That line was the only one that ever mattered. Noah turned 9 in March. We had a party at my house. Small, just Derek and Kevin, Derek's friend from work, and Noah's 2 new friends from school, and a dog-shaped cake that Noah had designed himself, and that I had done my best to execute, and that looked honestly more like a large tan blob than a dog, which Noah found extremely funny. He laughed about it for the better part of an hour. He laughed with his whole body, the way he always had, the way Eleanor would have loved to see. After the candles were blown out and the presents were opened, I was washing up in the kitchen, and I heard Noah in the next room asking Derek something. I couldn't hear the question. I heard Derek's answer, which was, "Always, bud. I've got you always." And I heard Noah say, "Okay," and then immediately transition to a very detailed complaint about how unfair it was that the dog-shaped cake had not had a tail because he had specifically drawn a tail in the design pop. I stood at the kitchen sink, and I laughed until my eyes were wet. And I thought, we're going to be okay. I know how long that road still is. I know that some of what happened will live in Noah in ways we can't fully see or predict. I know that easy is not the same as fine, and fine is not the same as healed, and healed is not the same as untouched. But I know my grandson is sleeping in a house where no door opens in the dark without his permission. I know his father is home every single night. I know that when Noah says something, someone listens. And when Noah is afraid, he does not have to hold that fear alone in the silence. I know that this child who makes his own light is surrounded by people who will never let that light go out. If this story found you, I want you to sit with it for a minute. Not with the drama of it or the details of it, but with the simplest thing inside it. A child who needed someone to look closer. That's all it was in the end. A child who needed one adult to stop accepting the easy answer and look closer. Maybe you have a child in your life, a grandchild, a student, a neighbor's kid. Someone who has gone quiet in a way that doesn't quite match who they were before. Maybe you've been telling yourself it's a phase. Maybe you've been telling yourself it isn't your place. It is your place. It is every decent adult's place. Look closer. Ask again. Believe them when they're too afraid to say the words clearly. Because fear speaks in body language and silence and reflexive apologies, and eyes that check the door before they speak. And if your gut tells you something is wrong, it is almost certainly telling you the truth. That small white camera on a bookshelf saved my grandson's life. But the camera was just a tool. What saved him was that someone loved him enough to stop minding their own business. Be that person. Be the one who looks closer. If this story meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you'd leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time of day it is there. It matters more than you might think, knowing that this story traveled somewhere and landed with someone who needed to hear it. If you know someone who needs to hear it too, please share it and subscribe to Ember Vengeance so you don't miss the next story I bring you. From my house in Knoxville, with a full heart and a photograph of my grandson laughing at a cake that looked nothing like a dog. Thank you for listening.